This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I am the host, John Moorhead, and I am privileged today to have as my guest. I asked her before the podcast how to pronounce her name, and hopefully I won't mess it up now that I'm recording. Batja Mesquita. How'd I do?
Perfect.
Wonderful. We're going to be discussing her book today. I'll hold it up for folks who are watching the video. Between Us, How Cultures Create Emotions, which is a fascinating book. And I will introduce her by way of the dust jacket on the book. She is a social psychologist, an affective scientist, and a pioneer of cultural psychology. She is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Leuven, Belgium, where she studies the role of culture in emotions and of emotions in culture and society. Mesquita spent her postdoctoral years at the University of Michigan, where she was part of the Culture and Cognition group that played a key role in the start of cultural psychology. She is director of the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology in Leuven. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
Well, it's good to have you here. The reason I'm so interested and glad that you're here today is I work in interreligious conflict, doing religious diplomacy, and I discovered a few years back that we neglect the emotional component. And I also have a graduate degree in intercultural studies. So to have you here and talk about culture and emotions is just fascinating. I like to start on a personal note. How did you, as you began your academic career, why this subject matter? What was your passion for it?
You never know. You're just interested, right? But I think there were several parts to that question. One was that I lived in Amsterdam, and at that point in the late 80s, we did start to be seeing in multicultural society in the Netherlands, especially in cities like Amsterdam, where we'd never had that before. I mean, so this is different from the United States. The Netherlands never was a multicultural society in the same way. So I think that was certainly part of it. I'm wanting to know why maybe sometimes emotions looked different, or what was at the base of misunderstandings. The other explanation that I give in my book, but that's really a post hoc explanation, is my parents were Jews hiding in the Second World War in the Netherlands. And so there was a lot of, for my family members who survived, there was a lot of trauma. And I always think that as a child born in the 60s in the Netherlands, a democratic, confluent country in a middle-class family, that I did not always have access to the circumstances that led to their emotions, so that I saw a lot of, grief and anxiety and shame and, whatnot, that I couldn't really explain from what I saw right in front of me. And I think that made me kind of that made me into a cultural psychologist in a way, because I wasn't, and maybe that relates to your topic, I don't think of culture only as the national borders. I mean, I don't think psychology particularly respects those borders. We have religions within, we have cohorts, we have generations, we have, parts of history that people live in, we have genders. I mean, all of those things matter, I think, for your emotions. So my thinking, in retrospect was, well, isn't this what I've always been doing as a child too, is figuring out why my parents had these emotions that were not immediately obvious to me, but that I wanted to understand from their experiences and from their values and memories. That's probably just the story that you're hinting to. Yeah.
Yes. I would agree with your, I don't know if you want to call it an expanded understanding of culture, but I think it's many times we have this reductionist kind of view of what it is. And I think your work is helpful as a corrective in that. You relay a story in your book about coming to America and having this awareness of different emotions were going on. Was that were those experiences before you had started your research work and then part
No,
of
it
the
was
process?
after, and
Oh,
this is really
after.
it's really interesting. I did research for my graduate work for my PhD. I did research in the Netherlands, and I compared, you know, majority. They were certainly majority at that point, Dutch people and people from Suriname and from Turkey, which were the biggest minority groups at the time. And that whole, I mean, I was pretty open for cultural differences, I think. I wasn't dumb. Um, but what I did not see during those 6 years of my PhD research is that Dutch emotions were also cultured. And so it was really interesting, but also in a way shocking and and an illustration of how hard it is to see your own emotions as anything but natural and default. But when I came to the US, I really felt I didn't fit in, and it was emotionally. I had a mismatch. And I can't say, I mean, this is also interesting. I can't say by the end of that, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the US. I became a citizen, even though I don't live there anymore. And I can't say at the end of it, I felt the same mismatch. I felt pretty good. But in the very beginning, it was really a confrontation with, you know, how much my emotions were tied to the culture that I came from. And, you know, you may know that the Dutch are known as blunt, um, blunt and direct, and also not as uplifting and positive. So critical, you know, and so what I think I describe misunderstandings both ways. I didn't, I felt I didn't live up to the mutual compliments, to the sort of positivity that exists, especially, I mean, I was in Michigan at the time, especially in the Midwest. I felt very much not at ease um, I just felt I underperformed. Like people were more grateful and more happy. And, you know, I asked the cleaning guy how he felt, and he said wonderful or terrific. And you know, when people asked me, I started to explain that, you know, this was good, this was not so good. I mean, I didn't have the, and so what I came to understand, and I think that's maybe important also when we talk about interreligious relations, is um, that it's very much, it's not that people are just making that up or are having those emotions out of space. It's very much what a culture focuses on. So, and that's also, I think, why you can learn to see it from that perspective. If you're constantly focusing, as many people in my Michigan environment did, and I think many Americans I know do, on the positive characteristic of somebody, of the contributions, of the responsibility that somebody has had to a positive outcome. Um, you know, that those are all, if you're focused on those things in the interaction, you are more grateful. You know, when I focus on what you've done for me, that, you know, this has been such a wonderful interview, I am more grateful than when I just think, oh, John is asking me the next question, what will it be? So I think that it's really, emotions are really reflect perspective taking, and the perspective taking is different. And other interesting, little interesting examples were, I described this in the book, but I had friends or new friends coming over for dinner, and I thought that we had a really good time that evening. And then they left and they said, thank you for a delicious dinner, Batja. And I was really disappointed because I thought, who would thank you? I mean, who would thank me if that was kind of focusing on an individual responsibility without focusing on the togetherness, the connectedness that I naturally focused on. And so, I've learned throughout the years that one is not necessarily at the exclusion of the other. But at that point, I really thought it was, because I was focused on how we had a good time together, and these could be friends. And this sounded to me very formal and distanced. Um, so a lot of things, my own anger and criticism that were misinterpreted, or not even anger, it was just, being blunt and expressive of opinion, I would say, also of not positive opinion. And I've learned that from my students, from my friends, that was maybe a little more than called for in the context of American interactions and relationships. But it's interesting because once you you sort of adopt the way of doing relationships and the goals of the interactions of the culture, the emotions are also much less out of sync.
It's fascinating that you had enough awareness that you were able to pick up on the differences and not just dismiss the American perspective as something that was deficient, which is, I think, what happens a lot of times. Our way, our assumptions are the only way to go. Uh, one of the central ideas of your book, you talk about the difference between mine and our emotions. Can you unpack that for us? What's that all about?
Yeah, in a lot, mine emotions are they're just little acronyms, and they don't exist out in the world, of course, mine and ours emotions. But what I use the distinction for is to describe that in many Western cultures, we think of emotions as something that is mental experiences that are inside the person. And we also think about it, many of your listeners will have seen the movie Inside Out, or the two movies Inside Out, as little figures that are always the same, basically, and they're in your head. So that's one way of looking at emotions. And there's a lot of the ways that we think about emotions are associated with that, because these emotions live inside our head, so they have to come out. They have to come out. If you don't express them, they're still there and they're somehow blocked. So that must be bad for you. Kind of a psychodynamic Freudian way of thinking that you better express your emotions. Um, in a lot of the world, we find that people don't think about emotions that way. They think about emotions mostly as things that happen between people. So when I'm angry, that's not a figure in my head, but that's something that happens between us that affects the relationship. They think about them as processes, because when they're between people, then the way they evolve or emerge is co-determined by the people in the relationship. And they also think, and it's all kind of connected, that emotions are not always the same, that they're situated. So that, what you and I, the emotion that happens between you and me is determined by the specific context, by you and me responding to each other. So it's a very different way of thinking about emotions. And what we find is that these ways of thinking, we're not talking about um, a star or a house that doesn't change as you're talking about it. We're talking about psychological and interpersonal processes. And so the way we think about it shapes how those processes are. So if you look at things like how do we perceive emotions? Well, if you have an idea that an emotion is in the person, you look at that person's face and body and listen to that person's voice, and you infer what emotion they have just from their own behavior. But if you think that an emotion is what's happening between people, then you might want to look at what's happening in the situation. So, what is happening between all the people involved, and maybe in the context. Um, Also, when you think that your emotions are inside and have to come out, then suppressing your expression is very hard and comes at a cost. And so, for example, people express their expression, so you suppress their expression, they start to feel the emotion more intensely. So it's really the Freudian idea that I'm trying to suppress my anger, but my anger is getting worse as I'm doing that. It wants to get out. So it's a hydraulic model, really. We don't find that in cultures that think about emotions as ours because people think that emotions are always situated. And so they find it not particularly out of place to adjust their emotions to whatever the situation requires or whatever expectations exists for how to behave. Um, so it turns out that I think the most important part about it is it turns out that emotions can be quite different creatures. And that's not to say that if you grew up in a culture that that they're instantly changeable, because of course, you have grown up with this idea of emotions, and that's how they work for you. But there is quite a bit of diversity in how people see their emotions, what they do with their emotions, what the consequences are, what good emotions are, even what healthy emotions are. So if we look at the emotions that are healthy, for physical health, the emotions that are bad or good for your physical health, the differences between cultures. And those differences seem to relate to what the emotions mean in a culture. So that's a very roundabout, long question to answer to your question about mine and ours. But mine and ours was one way of distinguishing very different ways of looking and conceptualizing emotions.
Moving from that broader conceptualization to some specifics so folks can kind of get an idea for how this works. Can you talk about how certain emotions like anger, pride, shame would be understood and maybe manifest themselves in a Western versus a non-Western context?
Yeah. Um, Let me preface that because, of course, Western and non-Western illustrates to us how, how I see, I'm slightly distracted by the cat.
My
Very cute.
co-host.
Yeah. Um, uh, just let me preface that by saying that as my own experience illustrates, there are many different differences within Western cultures. There are many differences between non-Western cultures. But what a few examples are that not in many Western cultures, anger, for example, it doesn't feel good when you're angry, but it's ultimately a positive emotion because it shows your autonomy, it defends your own individual needs, it shows other people that you are capable of drawing boundaries. Um, so in effect, anger is consistent, you can say, with the relationship goals of many cultures, not in the sense that we like relationships where there's a lot of anger, but we think anger has a place and that, when when the relationship is not going according to your needs, that or rights, when what's happening is unfair, we think people do well being angry. Not in any way. I mean, we don't think that people should, fight and hit upon and be physically aggressive. And sometimes we think, assertiveness is valued. Verbal aggression is not always valued either, although in the current political climate, I sometimes wonder. Um, but that is certainly not true for a lot of other cultures where anger is a sort of a last, not a last resort, where it's actually very immature. You see anger in many cultures, anger is, selfish, is egoistic, is childish. Um, you prioritize the needs of the relationship, not the needs of the individual. And so anger doesn't serve the relationship. It separates you from the other person. And what that means is that there is a very different socialization of anger, very different prevalence of anger, but also actually that when people are the beginning of anger, when they feel offended, um, for example, we find in Japanese research that people try to very much take into account what the other person's needs are, what their perspective would be. They think about how to avoid conflict at all. They think about how to save the relationship and the harmony in the relationship. And we see that in different contexts. We also see that, when we ask couples about conflict, they basically say conflict is a very you should always look at how to avoid conflict. And one way of avoiding it is taking the perspective of the other person and seeing, why did this other person do what they did? How can I accommodate their wishes and needs? And so there is a different kind of perspective taking. We see it as early as a young kids that they just don't respond with anger, and say that no, they would maybe they would think, what did I do wrong that my dad got snappy at me, for example. So anyway, that's anger. Shame, another one is. Shame is very different in that, especially in America, I would say there's a sociologist, Thomas Sheff, who says that shame is the invisible emotion because it's so hurtful to have shame that everybody tries to avoid it, and that even if you feel a little bit of shame, you don't own up to it. You say, "Oh, that's that was un- uncomfortable or uneasy." Um, in many cultures, shame is actually a good emotion. In the sense, again, it's not a pleasant emotion. It's never pleasant to see that you didn't live up to others' expectations, but it's a good emotion in the sense that it shows others that you're aware of the norms and the social expectations. And it's also a good emotion because um, you basically take the opportunity to make up with your environment. And you show them that you are a moral person. So it's also good for children, for example. Children are raised to feel shame in many cultures, because it shows, well, it gives them the opportunity to be um, moral, uh, well-behaved kids, but also because it shows to their parents, for example, their family, that they're well raised kids. So it restores the reputation of the family when the kids show shame. So very different approaches to those emotions. And what it means is that it has consequences for prevalence, for sure. It has consequences for how hurtful or bad the consequences of those emotions are. So how other people, the social outcomes of those emotions. It also has consequences for how people behave when they have those emotions. So shame is very is um, freezes many Western people. I mean, when we're ashamed, we don't know what to do anymore. We freeze. We want to withdraw. We feel uneasy and incompetent, and we can't really relate very well. We see that in many other cultures, shame is taken as a signal that you should um, you should gear up a little bit, and do a little bit more to make to smoothen out your social relationships. So you should accommodate more to other people and make sure that you do meet expectations and norms. And so you see that it has very different implications for the relationship. Shame is actually the glue or facilitator of relationships in many non-Western cultures. Not all, but many, and a stumble block in many Western cultures.
In your research, when differing emotional cultures, I don't even know if that's the right term to use, but cultures with different understandings of emotion come together, are there certain common misunderstandings that take place?
Um, we are only starting to study that. So a lot of the research is about not about understanding or misunderstanding or how you can bridge differences, but it's about describing those differences. But of course, you can imagine I mean, we have some research and anecdotal evidence that people misunderstand each other. We have a lot of evidence from anthropologists, of course, who go into the field and then describe their own dealing with a new culture and describe how many misunderstandings they have and how, misunderstandings on both sides, like the a woman who we haven't talked about that emotions, but an anthropologist who is um, uh, rewarding, who basically smiles to a girl who's excitedly happy, and the environment says it's on some Pacific island, and the surrounding women say you shouldn't be smiling at her. She should not be so happy because that makes her neglect her duties and it makes her immoral. You should be you should be justified angry is what they call it in there. So or a Canadian anthropologist who joins a small group of Inuits and learns that any irritation is basically childish and dangerous, also considered dangerous. And of course, she is irritated and then gets to deal with um, being excluded by the group. So we have those descriptions. We also have reflections on those descriptions. I mean, the more modern anthropologists reflect on their own emotions, and on their own interactions. The older ones used to say things like, "Oh, they're really sad, but they don't have a word for it, and so they say they're tired." Um, so it was kind of, they have a false consciousness. The modern ones try to do what I think is helpful, is getting into the meaning systems of another culture. Is why is it in this culture that anger is such a bad emotion? How is that dealt with? Or why is it that excited happiness is thought to be immoral? Why should you raise kids to have balance and equanimity? Um, so, those are interesting questions, I think. In terms of systematic psychological research, we are only starting to look at, first of all, what people do in intercultural interactions. There's a little bit of research in in the negotiation literature or in the business literature, about in the communication literature, about what different expectations people have from the communication that comes close, but really not a lot about what you can do to bridge differences in emotions. And we're starting to. My hunch would be, I mean, I have to say I wrote this book about cultural differences in emotions because that's where the research is. And then at the end of it, my publisher said, "Well, that's all good and well, but yeah, but what do people need to take away from this? What does that mean?" And so, that gave me pause. And I thought, the only thing that we can say for sure is that there are people who have done it. I mean, they're both people who moved from one culture to the next and were successful at it, started to understand the differences or started to understand different meaning systems of emotions, different ways of doing emotions. So we can learn probably from biculturals. We can probably learn from anthropologists. And I've learned quite a bit myself. And how did I do that? And I so what we're testing now is if you tell people in what ways emotions differ across cultures, do they get better at communicating about these differences in emotions? So, for example, I mentioned a few things like, what is really the meaning of the situation? What is important here? Well, in America, it's important that everybody feels good about themselves. In the Netherlands, it's good that everybody is equal and gets their share and that you defend your needs. So it's more about not about everybody feeling good about themselves, but about saying your mind and carving out a space, I would say. That's kind of and with not you always try to avoid that people are unequal or that some people feel better than other people. That's less of a concern, I think, in America, although you try in a conversation to have everybody feel good. Um, but what are the events? Are events where that happens, the good events, or events where that doesn't happen? The worst possible offense in the Netherlands is that you don't take another person seriously, that you make them wait, for example, don't value their time as much as your time. That's a horrible offense. What is the worst offense in the US? I think from what if this is of course all um, yeah, it's not making any distinction. It's a very high level of abstraction at which I describe this, but I would say is making a person feel bad about themselves. That would be particularly bad in the US. So So I think one of the things that's important is what are the big values? What are the big concerns in relationships? And what is it? What does it mean to be a valued, moral, good person? And what does it mean to be valued as such? And how does a given event interfere with that? Or how is it conducive to that? The other one is really what do people think their emotion is? So again, when you say I can say about almost the same given that I'm jealous, sad, and angry. And I can go from one to the next. Um, and so labeling myself is important, and the different labels that people have are important. And what's important with that is what does that label mean? So when we talked about shame and anger or even excited happiness, is that a good emotion or a bad emotion? No Western person, I think, well, I don't know about the Scandinavian countries, but I mean, certainly, certainly in the US, nobody would say, no white person would say, is this child excited, happy? Or that would be really weird that that's not the best you could achieve. There's actually quite a bit of research that Asian Americans value excited happiness less and calm happiness more. Um, so, so the emotions themselves have meaning and social significance and social implications. And then, of course, there is the idea of on the behavioral side, what does the behavior mean? So, what does it tell you that somebody is um, very, very aggressive physically? And in some cultures, it means they're out of control. In other cultures, it actually means they're in control because the system is that, especially in honor cultures, if somebody threatens your honor, you have to make sure that they understand that they can't just do that, that, that doesn't go unpunished. And how do you do that? By showing yourself strong. And that's even the case in research done in the US with Southerners and Northerners, where Southerners are more, at least white Southerners have more of an honor culture and are more aggressive when they're insulted than Northerners who are more accommodating. And so there's a different meaning there, but also when you see the behavior, it means something else. So anyway, I think that those are probably this is a domain, this is a really important domain of investigation, I think. But these are some first guidelines to look at other people's emotions and try to understand them.
Yeah, I think it's obviously I wouldn't have had you here if I didn't think it was an important domain, but I am surprised to hear that there hasn't been more research done in those areas up to this point, which leads me to the last question that I have, and I'm hoping to make application. It would seem to me that in governments could use this in diplomacy. I work in religious diplomacy, in interreligious conflict, and we tend to, in my experience, I think a lot of interfaith organizations do this. They focus on understanding of ideas, but there is little, if any, consideration of the differing emotions. I understand cognition as both the so-called rational and the emotional working synergistically, but we tend to see that as a binary. Don't be so emotional, right? If we just put that to the side, that we can focus on what's really important, which is the ideas. So how might we be more emotionally aware of the cultural differences of emotions and the role that that can play in things like diplomacy and conflict, whether in politics or religion?
I very much agree with your approach, and I think this is one of the few areas in emotion research where psychologists and philosophers and sociologists actually agree, is that emotion and cognition are very much intertwined. And what I usually say is that when you look at emotions, you're actually looking at meaning, giving meaning um, of the most important events or issues in a person's life. So emotions, you don't have an emotion when you don't care or when it's a distant reality. I don't have an emotion when I describe my screen as being rectangular. I have an emotion when I am giving meaning to something that's really important to me. For example, that they insult the God that I have. One of the interfaith, you could say, conflicts that I describe in the book was in Europe. That in Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, that were really insulting to the Muslim group in that country, but also beyond and I think it had huge consequences for the relationships between Muslims and the rest, you could say, of the society that is still based in, I mean, it's modern, not religiousness, not religiosity, but it clearly has grown, mainstream society has grown out of Christian values, of course. And I think this idea of that I mean, I don't know that people would not, that Christians wouldn't dislike those kinds of cartoons if they were made of Jesus or of God. I mean, that's just
Mhm.
mirroring the situation. But I think there was an extra element of that insulting the prophet is really playing with a whole group's honor. It's the most sacred thing. And I think in that discussion, um, the Westerners emphasized that there was freedom of expression. Um, the that I think is not irrelevant, but being free to express something doesn't mean that you have to do it.
Yes.
I'm not, it's, I am free to call you an asshole, but I would still not do it. Um, because, you know, partly because I don't think it, but partly because that wouldn't end our conversation so well. And, and I don't think you would like it. And I care about the relationship. And so I think in a way, considering the meaning for other people, and even if that the meaning of those same events is not exactly the same, is really valuable. And of course, when it's important enough, when the event is important enough, people have emotions. And then they're emotional and of course they're emotional. I mean, what they hold dearest has been offended. And that's an offense or an attack and a non-acceptance, and a threat to their position in that society. So yeah, I think of emotions as a good entry into what is important to people. And so in a way, rather than dismissing, I mean, opposite to dismissing emotions, you should be most focused on what people have emotions about, because that's most important in their lives. That's almost the definition of emotions, is that you care about something, that it's positive or negative, and in a lot of different ways. And I think really understanding, and I sometimes have problems with the word empathy because it gets used in so many different ways. And empathy can mean I'm imagining what I would feel if I were in your situation. And I think that kind of empathy is not really helpful in this interfaith conflicts, because I don't feel anything when I see the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. I feel maybe even that it's funny, but that's not the point. The empathy should be about, if I held something dearly, and if joking with it, or making cartoons, would be very offensive and would be a sign that my group wasn't respected in this society. What then would I feel? And then I think we would come a lot closer to understanding, and to maybe also come to compromises. You know, I, that I think, yes, freedom of speech is very, very important, in Western society, but freedom of offense may not have to be given priority. So this is how and I don't think there is we don't look at the world in the same way. And faith is a very important way in, divider, and, a culture, I would say, in which certain things are important and are made and are shared. I mean, that makes it extra important, are shared within a group. So for me, I very much agree that emotions would be the starting point of looking at interfaith conflict.
Is there, I always like to give guests an opportunity. Is there any question you wish I would have asked that could help bring something out about your book? Anything important that I've missed?
I think you had some very important, I didn't think of that ahead of time, but I think these were some really important, these were some really important questions, I think. And especially the latter part, of course, is really important.
Yes.
And also I think, so I maybe one thing I want to say is, it's what emotion, what the meaning of events that is different in different cultures. It's the kind of emotions and what those emotions mean, but also what those emotions look like. Your anger may not be the same as my anger. And it's also the meaning of behavior that is different in different cultures. And I would imagine also in different faith cultures. That's my way of looking at faith communities, at least, not at faith itself, but is that you have shared understandings of what is important in the world, what is dear, what needs to be cultivated, and what needs to be avoided. So yeah, we don't just have different emotions, but the emotions themselves are also slightly different.
Hmm. I again, I find your work fascinating. We have at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy these heart and mind conversations that we do with small groups, bringing people together to build trust through deep differences. And I wanted to make sure that we were adequately accounting for the emotional component, especially after reading your book. So I had a conversation with AI and mentioned your book and said, how can we take better advantage of this? And one of the suggestions was that our methodology is good, but we could go deeper by including emotional checkpoints in our conversation to find out what would your culture, how did it shape you emotionally in response to what you've been talking about, something like that. So I hope to continue incorporating the insights of your research into our work. I find it fascinating.
Thank you for doing that. I would say, I don't know if you need this on the podcast, but I would say I wonder if people are aware of that without comparing it to other people. Because, I thought I was quite focused on culture when I went to America. And I figured it out the hard way, how my culture shaped me. And not particularly unpleasant. It's also enriching, but it's not something that in my study in the Netherlands I had come up with. And so I think it's often by comparison with other people and seeing how you differ or how you understand each other and checking, do I understand this well? And one of the things that I say in the book is that I think humility is a really important starting point because I don't know how you feel. I mean, I might not know it within a culture. I have enough difficulties with my own spouse, but across cultures, it's even more difficult. And I think the humility of trying to find out what is actually happening from the perspective of this other person, what feelings they have, why they think they have them, what is important in their view about what's happening or about even the interaction, how do they interpret their emotional response? Is that just what everybody would be expected to do? Is it because I was so angry? Is it because, I mean, it's just interesting to hear people out and not have an opinion about, well, and that's one of the things. There is no normal or abnormal. There are different ways of doing emotions, and there are different contexts of doing emotions. And for me, it has been really interesting to interesting and enriching also for myself to try to understand these different ways of doing emotions because it's not that it completely changed me emotionally, but it does provide me more possibilities, a larger scope of possibilities. Yeah, you could be angry when you don't get what you want. You could also try to understand why this other person didn't think of giving you what you wanted, or what you did maybe to not deserve it, or what you could do to elicit more of the behavior you want, or and some cultures are more focused on that, on what can I do. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's yeah, I'm really curious what happens in your, what do you call it, in your groups,
Heart and mind conversations.
your mind conversations.
I
Yeah.
will certainly keep in touch and hopefully we can continue to incorporate your work. But I want to again thank you for coming on the podcast. Here it is again, folks. You'll see a link in the program notes, and the book is Between Us: How Cultures Create Emotions. It is highly recommended, whether you're just want to understand your emotions, your culture's emotions, or if you do work in interfaith or diplomacy of any kind, it's highly recommended. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, John, for having me.